A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
And we're going to get into all sorts of depth around money and the kingdom of God. And as you'll know, money's a sticking point, even for a lot of Christian believers. So we're going to return to what for some is, well, you might even say, the most challenging topic and one of the hardest to align for the Christian. We're going to talk money today and where your money and mine fit into the plans and purposes of God. You'll remember Jesus spoke of money like this. He said, "No one can serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." You might have heard us recently talking about a new initiative that is designed to supercharge Christian organisations that have been challenged with Christian fundraising efforts. Christian Ministry Advancement, or CMA, has just launched what they called the CMA Fundraising Network. The launch tour of 5 of our national capital cities featured one of the best speakers in the world in this Christian space around money. That speaker is our special guest today. He has an interesting reputation. He's called the Generosity Monk. Dr. Gary Hoag. He's president and CEO of Global Trust Partners. He's back home in the US. He's in Denver and, as I understand it, in the middle of a blizzard. Hey, Gary, welcome back to 2020.
Well, it's good to be with you. And no kidding, I enjoyed warm weather in Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, and Adelaide. And I returned home to freezing weather. And we've just crossed 20 inches of snow today.
Well, some of us might be thinking you've got a wonderful view of incredible mountains that will be snow-covered right now, so there's a certain romanticism when we're at the end of our summer and into our autumn. It's still quite warm in so many places around Australia, but there you are in the middle of a blizzard, and no doubt it's quite cool. Hey, Gary, let me start with asking you... Yep.
It is romantic, but it's a lot to shovel, and it cut our power out for 3 hours today. So I'm just thrilled to be with you.
Well, we're hoping our line holds firm and going to have a great conversation ahead. Hey, Gary, you're known as the Generosity Monk. We've all got pictures of you with a balding head. Is that part of it?
You know, the background on Generosity Monk is, it goes back to July 26, 2009. I was in a transition season, and many of you listeners, you might be in a transition season. This is where I found myself. I said, "Lord, what do you want me to do?" And I felt like the Lord said, "I don't need you to do anything." And I needed to hear that from the Father, because I think I was asking the wrong question. And then I think the Spirit led me to pivot the question to, what do you want me to be? And when I asked the question, what do you want me to be? For some, he's just going to say, "I want you to grow as a man of God or a woman of God, and then you'll be ready for the next appointment I have for you." But for me, as I sat in silence, I think I heard him say, "Gary, I want you to be the Generosity Monk." And I laughed, and just like Sarah laughed when God said, "I want you to be a mommy," back in the Bible story of Abraham and Sarah, I laughed and I said, "Wow, Lord, well, that sounds like me, and so what will my daily office be?" And it would be to post daily meditations, which I've done for 14 and a half years. But when it came to that daily office, or that monk title, it just centers around, Neil, a commitment. I dedicated myself 14 and a half years ago, dedicated my life to encouraging Christian generosity. And it's been an amazing journey ever since.
We're going to talk about generosity, and we're going to talk about another dimension that goes hand in hand with generosity, and that's that word accountability. And that might be an individual accountability, but it also might be an accountability to organisations that are handling as stewards the money that is given by people who might be supporters of that organisation. We want to be able to enlarge a little bit on that. But before we do, let me ask you about some things around money and the kingdom of God, because there's a lot of people who say, well, you know, if God is God and he's all powerful and he's everywhere, why does he need my money in the first place? What do you see as this connection between money and God's kingdom purposes?
You know, I would say this to those people. God blesses us to be a blessing. He resources us to participate with him in his kingdom. And when he resources us, he maybe gives us talents and abilities or financial resources. And then often the Spirit whispers to us, you know, you should give to that. You should get involved in that. And what's interesting, and this is the paradox of life in the kingdom, he doesn't make us do it. But when we do it, we don't end up empty. We end up enriched. We don't end up destitute. We learn our role is to distribute. And when we don't participate, the irony is we're the ones who miss out. Like when he whispers to us to help that person in need and we don't do it, he's just going to whisper to someone else. He's going to make sure that need gets met, whether we participate with him or not. And so money in the kingdom is this tool that is also a test of our allegiance, and it's like a trademark showing who we represent, like our brand, and showing we represent Christ to a watching world.
What did you glean from meeting so many Australians on your recent tour here? You went to 5 capital cities, a guest of CMA, the CMA Fundraising Network, a major program, and I'm going to give listeners a way they can connect there too. But what did you glean from the sort of questions Aussies were asking, or the sorts of messages you were delivering in our capital cities? Is there something you can identify? Is there an element of our Australian money personality that struck you while you were here?
Sure. First of all, this was my 10th trip to Australia. And on my prior 9 trips, I had visited all 5 cities, but I'd never done all 5 on one trip. So it was an amazing adventure. Second, when we gathered at each one of the events, I started the event by just sharing 3 biblical ideas. And then I got them talking with a question, like which biblical idea resonated with you? Because the goal was to build a network. And so I got them talking with each other. And so the first thing I would tell you, Neil, is that they were hungry and receptive to talk about what the Bible teaches on the handling of money and what the Bible teaches on encouraging others to give it. So that really encouraged me.
So the sorts of principles that we might talk about, those things that are biblical ideas that the Aussies were desperate to receive when you were here, what is it you can share with us? And perhaps in a nutshell, because we've got lots of other things to talk about, but what sort of biblical ideas were actually ticking the boxes?
Sure. Let me share the 3 points I shared with them briefly. The first one was, I told them as fundraisers, I said, generous giving links to a fundraiser's faithful activities, to a ministry's larger efforts, and to God's work in the lives of stewards. So I wanted them to know, and I read 1 Corinthians 3, 6 through 9, where it says, you know, it's not really about Paul or it's not really about Apollos, it's really about Christ, and we're just part of God's building, God's field. And so the first point I shared with them was that you play an important role, but I wanted them to know it's not too important or less important, that you play an important role, like the Levites of old facilitated the giving of the people to God's temple. I said, you play an important role in facilitating the act of worship that's people's giving, but it's really God that brings the growth in people's lives. So that was the first point that inspired them. Any thoughts in reply, Neil?
Well, thinking of the Levites of old, of course, that was the priestly class, and they were the ones who were given responsibility by God to look after the worship activities of the nation. So while there were 12 tribes, they were just one. So I guess there's a certain sense here in which the responsibility to be in that worship space it matters for a whole nation, not just for the one tribe.
There you go. And so based on that first point, I shared this second point with them. I said, generosity flows from transformed hearts as they conform to the image of Christ. But then I added, and just giving flows from stewards with a wide range of spiritual maturity. So there's two parts to that second point. When I say generosity flows from transformed hearts as they conform to the image of Christ, I taught the group that the Greek word agathosune is what appears in the famous fruit of the Spirit verse. So the fruit of the Spirit, when God's working in a person's life, this is what I told the fundraisers. When God's working in their life, a fruit of that work in their life is going to be love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity. I showed them that when God's at work in people's lives, generosity is going to flow. So you want to encourage God's working in people's lives and your interaction with them. This is much bigger than, will you give money to help us meet budget? You want to encourage them to be this conduit of blessing. But I warned them and I said, ordinary giving flows from stewards from a wide range of spiritual maturity. And I gave the example of Barnabas and Ananias and Sapphira. And I told them that New Testament giving example shows that there's one person who's holding nothing back, and there's another that's hold something back. And this is just a reality they're going to face. And they appreciated the candor because this inspired them to play a role to encourage people to hold nothing back, to encourage people to conform their lives to the image of Christ. And when they do that, generosity will be a byproduct of who they are, not just something they do.
What about the third point? How does that fit in?
So the third point is Christian fundraising secures gifts for mission and finds its greatest purpose when fundraisers help stewards grow as givers who are rich toward God. You probably recognize that phrase, Neil. We talked about it previously, where the rich fool is blessed to be a blessing, and he really loses the responsibility because he's not a steward who's rich toward God. And so what I concluded was, I said, you're going to find your greatest purpose in your work, not when you help your organization fund a project, not when you raise funds to build a building, not when you balance the budget of the local church. You're going to find your greatest purpose when your efforts encourage stewards and help stewards grow as givers who are rich toward God. And they just love that. So I just turned them loose to talk, and different people said different points resonated with them and inspired them. So the Aussies were like, they gravitated to it because they said what they loved about it is it felt authentic. They said, this is truly our calling. It's not just tell me some tactics to go convince people to give money. And so I think what I noticed about an Aussie audience compared to other audiences is when I threw that out there and I gave biblical foundation for these points, all their questions were after the sale questions. They were like on it, and they said things like, this makes me feel free. It makes me feel empowered. And yeah, they appreciated both the biblical and the authentic nature of the message.
Gary, let's take a call. Richard is in Swansea in Tasmania. Hey, Richard, welcome along.
Yeah, g'day. Thank you, speaker. G'day, Gary and Neil. Thanks for your...
Our pleasure. What are your thoughts here, Richard?
Well, you'd mentioned at the start of the talk about, God's a really generous God. He's got all the money in the world. He doesn't really need our money. Why does he ask for it? And I think my thoughts is it's testing our heart because so many people put so much emphasis on their money and getting more that are you prepared to give that? And it's really testing where our heart is.
Good thought. Gary, a test of the heart and our money. What are your thoughts here for Richard?
Well, first of all, Richard, the first three people I talked to when I said I was coming to the 5 different states, they said, why didn't you go to Tassie? So I promised to come on my 11th trip to Australia. Now, that said, Richard, you're spot on. So God doesn't need our money. He wants our hearts. And the paradox is our hearts always go where we put God's money. Now, let me give you an example. When I was like a 16-year-old kid and I had my first car, and, I would wash it every weekend or whatever, I put hard-earned money from my early years of working into that old used car. And so where was my heart? My heart was in that car. And so when we pour a bunch of money into something, it becomes really important to us, right? And so God wants us to pour the money that He's given us. He wants us to pour that money into things of the kingdom because He knows our heart always follows where we put His money. And so I couldn't agree more, Richard. And thanks for calling in from Tassie with that great point to emphasize.
Anything further to add, Richard?
Oh, yeah, indeed. I remember a minister saying, don't hold on to your money tightly. And he showed himself standing out with two clenched fists and reaching up, giving it to God, because it only hurts when God takes it away. And he's then slowly prized open his fists. And it's true. I said the other day, and my wife's hearing it, it's fun spending somebody else's money. And she sort of looked at me and thought strange. I said, yeah, it's God's money. It's not ours. And she realised and cottoned on that really when we look at what we've been given, as it's not ours, we're just stewards. And, gee, it's great fun to bless somebody with what God has given us. And He promises that He'll provide seed to the sower to give to those that, to do His kingdom, to do His work.
Fabulous insights. Richard in Swansea in Tasmania. Richard, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. Gary, I want to take you into your thoughts around the second dimension that you work with so closely, because when we're talking generosity, sometimes we think, well, if we're going to be generous to someone that's going to be trustworthy with what we're being generous with. What are your thoughts on this second big dimension that you work with, and that is this area of accountability?
Thanks, Neil. So let me phrase it this way for listeners. If you're thinking about different charities you want to support, if you're thinking about what is the church doing with the money, one of the things that I have the privilege of doing with Global Trust Partners and in Australia with CMA and the CMA Standards Council is encouraging churches and ministries to follow standards in governance, administration, and their fundraising in a way that exhibits transparency. Because when you oversee things well, you administrate them with integrity, and you have financial transparency, people understand what happens with the money. That all comes together to paint a picture of accountability. And then when you sow the biblical truths that we've talked about, that Richard just emphasized, when we sow those biblical truths and you have the accountability, you have both sides of the coin, and you're going to see a lot of resources flow to the kingdom.
What does transparency look like in practice? Any thoughts here? I know there'll be lots of listeners who are they're connected with their local church. Some are going to be with not-for-profits, Christian charities. What does the transparency look like there?
Sure. So at every church or ministry, there are funds that flow in. And so first and foremost, you want to make sure that money is handled with financial controls to avoid the temptation. Financial controls means at every turn, at least two people are watching over or handling the money to remove the temptation of theft or really any activity that would bring dishonor to God. And so where transparency comes into view is when that money's handled properly and it's accounted for, and it's independently reviewed or audited by financial auditors, it produces statements, and those statements are available to anyone on written request. They're provided at the annual meeting of a church or in an annual report of a ministry. And what this does is it shows, look, we're following standards. It's been independently verified. And when that all happens, it builds trust. And when there's trust, people don't flinch. They have confidence that God's whispered to them, I want you to give. The ministry has given them the gift of accountability, transparency. They've showed that, you know what? We're going to steward. You're stewarding God's money. Just like that caller Richard said, it's God's money that I steward. You're stewarding it well, and you don't want to give it to a ministry unless you have confidence they're stewarding it well. So transparency gives that confidence. Hey, the ministry's stewarding this well. You can release these funds that belong to God.
Okay, taking calls on 1-800-316-316. Let's squeeze in another one just before news. Leilani is also in Tasmania. Hey, Leilani, welcome.
Hi, and thank you for that. I'm really interested in you. I'm really enjoying your show. Thank you so much.
That's okay. We need to be quick, Leilani. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, we have a cleaning ministry. I've spoken to you once before called Cleaning with Care for You in Your Home, and it was to serve people on low incomes. And one of the things when I started this, a friend gave us a thing. If you're doing it for money, it's a job. If you're doing it to serve the Lord, it's a ministry. And we found through this, we don't charge big. Everyone says you're too cheap, but we know God supplies our needs, not our wants. And, you know, we have a servant heart for it. And God's just been wonderful and blessed us ministry and for 13 years now. So, you know, I hear what you're saying. It's true. And your heart's right. It makes all the difference.
What a beautiful story, Leilani. A quick response here because we're going up to news. Thoughts here, Gary?
Sure. My quick response, Leilani, is keep doing it for God. And I would encourage you to look up, if this interests you, I would encourage you to look up the CMA Standards Council and have your ministry get accredited with them. Because what this will give you is external verification that you're stewarding God's resources properly, and that'll just give people more confidence to fund you and your work for years to come.
Gary, we'll take some calls in just a few moments, but I've already just broached the idea that Australian coffee is different to American coffee, and you've been to Australia 10 times. Give us your impressions of Australian coffee.
So I want to say, I like to say to my Australian friends, thank you for ruining my ability to enjoy coffee throughout the year and when I'm not in Australia, because your standards are so high, your coffee is so good, that when I travel back to America and I have a cup of brewed coffee or I go to a coffee shop, I just kind of shrug and I just say, wow, this is just nothing like Australian coffee. So hat tip to you all, but let me make the connection between coffee and accountability and generosity. So you become known around the world for having some of the best coffee in the world. And I know the baristas argue whether it's better in Brisbane or better in Melbourne or better in Sydney. And I'm going to tell you, it's awesome in all those places because Adelaide and Perth too, and if you're listening in Tassie, but I haven't been there yet to taste it. So, but the reason it's so good is because you've set your standards high. And what I want to challenge you to do is if you're in church or ministry work, I want to set your standards. I want you to set your standards of governance and administration as high as you set your coffee standards. And with that challenge, I want you to know that when we are not just representing a coffee brand, but when we are representing our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, we need to go above and beyond what the ACNC, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, says we should do to obey the law. We should follow higher standards so that when people see our ministries, they have the same response that when they sip a long black or a flat white, they say, that was an excellent cup of coffee. In the same way, that is an excellent ministry, how it's being administrated and governed. And when that accountability happens, those following those high standards, and it's accredited, it's verified, there's a seal, that gives people confidence and generosity flows. So that's my connection, Neil, between great coffee and running ministries with excellence to exhibit accountability and to encourage generosity to flow.
Well, so many people are fanatical about a good coffee, and there are those, every one of our listeners will know someone who is a real fanatic, and they just love the highest and best standards of their coffee. And thank you for the compliment of how good coffee is here in Australia. I hear that everywhere, that American coffee just does not cut it when it's compared to an Australian coffee. Hey, we're taking calls on 1-800-316-316. Let's hear from Anne in Labrador in Queensland. Hey, Anne, welcome along.
Oh, welcome. I've already been up to Vision Radio and I've enjoyed the visit.
Very good, Anne.
You were on when I was visiting. Anyway,
Good.
To get back to the question, or the things that I wanted to talk about, yep. I do donate to Vision Radio. I don't come an Extra Mile partner, but I'm Extra Mile partner for Bible League, and I've been doing those for years and years and years. The other thing I do too, to bless other people, is I do Diamantes, and I also do painting by numbers, and I have blessed people by giving those away as well. So that's just part of my ministry that I've been doing, and I think it's great to use God's money for His purpose and His plans, and so I think it's just great that we can have the ability to do that. I'm a pensioner now, so it's not as easy, but I have been to the Visionathons for many, many years.
And wonderful to hear the insight that you just offered there. And you're a pensioner. You are even a financial supporter of Vision. And today's not a fundraiser for Vision, by the way. We're talking about how you can be generous in whatever ministry you're connected to. But you raised a really important point, that you're doing what you can, not only with money, but what you can do with the craft of your hands. And I'm going to just throw this to Gary now. Gary, thoughts here for Anne, because there's a dimension in generosity that goes beyond our money. Any thoughts here for Anne?
You know, I love that you emphasize do what you can, because each one of us plays a part. 1 Peter 4:10 and 11 says, each one of you should use whatever gift God's given you to serve others. And so what's interesting about that, the Greek in that verse, is gift is singular. So that means Anne has a unique contribution to make, like a piece in a puzzle. I love every Christmas to do a puzzle, and over Christmas break. And one Christmas 2 years ago, we built the whole puzzle, and there was a piece missing in the middle, and it just wasn't complete. So I tell people, if you're not using your gift, the picture around you is incomplete. Make sure everyone does their part. God's gifted each one of us to play a role in His kingdom.
Anne in Labrador, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Our special guest is Gary Hoag. He's known as the Generosity Monk. We're talking generosity and also accountability. Gary, let me take you back to accountability, because when you say accountability, of course there's a personal accountability for all of us, but your message on accountability is a message to the church. It's to ministry workers. It's to those people who are in charge of the finances of an organisation. Take us into the value of the people who are in charge and bringing that integrity to light and the transparency that's going to actually see that whole thing go on to success. What are your thoughts here for those who are in charge?
So for those who are in charge, I want to remind you that you have a responsibility to preserve God's honor and God's reputation through your administration and your governance. Because if something goes wrong and goes corrupt at one church or one ministry, the media has a frenzy with it in the public sector, and then they affix that sin of corruption, of financial mismanagement on all pastors and all ministries. So I challenge church and ministry workers to remember that it's not just your church whose reputation you're upholding. It's God's reputation. And so the reason to go above and beyond maybe what the government standards are for church and ministry, charity, administration, and governance is because it's God's reputation we steward.
I'm just astounded because you've drawn out such a dimension here that God's reputation is what is important, and his reputation often stands or falls in the eyes of a community by the way that his followers actually look after the things that they are entrusted with. And when we're talking about money, we're talking about all of those different areas where the transparency is necessary. So when the church or when Christian organisations are not transparent, it does God's reputation no good. But when there is transparency and when there is faithful administration, when there's good governance, God's reputation rises. Is this a way we connect the way God actually shows his glory in the earth? Sometimes his glory is connected to that reputational value. Thoughts here, Gary?
Yes, when I was shifting in the ministry fundraising network launch meetings in Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, and Adelaide, when I was shifting from the biblical points to the practical points, one of the practical points I shared was to do an annual report, which is a combination of proclaiming, look at all the great program fruits that God gave us this year, and look at how we stewarded the money that you entrusted to us, and putting together an annual report. And what I want to say to you, Neil, and what I want to say to Aussies out there is I was really moved at in every single one of those 5 events we did in the 5 cities, at least one person came to me and said, you know what? I'm convicted. I need to do the work of doing an annual report because I owe it to the constituents I serve to give an account of not only the good things that God did this year, so God will get the glory, but to give an account for our stewardship so that they're going to be confident to renew their support again next year. Thanks for giving us an example and showing us how to do that.
There are some government initiatives that have expectation around all organisations so far as their accountability and some of these audits go. Is there a extra dimension that when we say this is a Christian organisation, that we can do more than what even the government is demanding? Any thoughts here around just how significant you and how seriously you take this issue of accountability?
Sure. Well, I'm going to tell a story of what happened in America, and then I'll tell the Australia story. First, the American story. I'm going to take you back, listeners, to 1979. 2 famous television evangelists in America were raising money for this and spending it on themselves. And it made the national media, and it caused a crisis of trust in America. 2 senators called Billy Graham, famous evangelist, and said, Billy, if you don't regulate your charity sector, if you guys don't get together and regulate yourselves, the government's going to regulate you. And if we regulate you, it's not going to be pretty. So let me tell you what happened. Billy Graham and others came together and they formed what's called a peer accountability group. Let's hold each other accountable to follow standards of responsible stewardship above and beyond what the government requires together to preserve God's honor. And so, friends, this organization, ECFA, was born 45 years ago. And today, people don't support a ministry in America unless they see that seal. It's become known as the seal you look for on a charity. And so today, over 2,800 of the leading ministries in America are accredited by ECFA, independent verification. They're following standards. And guess what? Last year, over $32 billion U.S. flowed through those 2,800 charities. So there's trust. Oh, I see that seal. They're handling God's money rightly. Fast forward to Australia. Friends, in the year 2016, I was there in Brisbane when the CMA Standards Council was launched to accredit churches and ministries for following higher standards. And then on this trip, we celebrated that now there's 24 accredited ministries and 20 in queue. And these are leading ministries that you would have heard of across Australia. And so I'm overjoyed to tell you, look for that seal, CMA Standards Council, to give you confidence that they're following standards above and beyond what's expected. And praise God, peer accountability groups are accrediting ministries in 16 countries now, all over the world. And that's what I get to apply myself to in my work with Global Trust Partners.
I imagine, Gary, to be given that accreditation by the CMA Standards Council. Do you have to jump through hoops? Is there extra levels of accountability and auditing programs that you will need to have in your Christian organisation in order to get that sort of accreditation? No doubt this is going to grow all the more because there are going to be challenging times, no doubt. But getting that accreditation, does this mean a whole lot of extra jumping through hoops to get that? And I guess you're going to say it's going to be worth it in the long run. But what are your thoughts here?
Sure. So I want you to go visit their website to see the specific hoops. And there are some hoops they encourage you to jump through above and beyond what the ACNC requires, but they're not onerous and they're not unrealistic. In other words, when you read them, you say, well, of course we should be doing these things. So it's just a few extra things to be sure that you're above and beyond what the ACNC says, preserving God's honor. The 9 principles or the 9 standards are listed on the CMA Standards Council website. And Steve Kerr, their founding director, he can walk you through. If you're a church or ministry worker, he can walk you through the steps to get accredited.
On the flip side of the accountable Christian organisation that is wanting to grow that trust with their supporters, on the flip side, you've got other words like rogue operators. And, I'm not going to be casting aspersions on different churches and ministries and charity organisations, but undoubtedly you don't want to be aligned with being a rogue organisation because as a Christian at the heart of the organisation that you're a part of and that you are running, you don't want to damage the reputation of God. Is this going to be something that all the more, especially in this day and age where AI is fueling so many more scams and that things are going wrong, that rogues need to be weeded out and that we need to look for those reputable organisations because the reputation of God is important? Thoughts here from you, Gary?
Yes, you're spot on. I'm actually going to quote you, Neil, because I love your alliteration, rogue versus respectable. You know, what this precisely does, the seal becomes a shield that protects the organization. Steve reported we did 5 gatherings celebrating the progress of the Standards Council in the 5 cities in Australia. And Steve celebrated that over the last year, though giving has been tough for many charities, 75% of the accredited charities giving was up. And so one of the things that having your house in order does is it eliminates any question in your mind that you're rogue, and it strengthens in people's minds that you are respectable and trustworthy. And so I just can't emphasize enough also that we never knew COVID was going to come, and it was just one storm of many storms ministries will face. And so if you go back to the wise man builds his house on the rock, if you're following standards, you're exhibiting accountability, people are going to get your annual report, and they're going to be confident that I want to continue supporting this ministry, maybe even if it requires sacrifice. Going back to the pensioner who was on the call just now, she attested to some of the giving she was doing, which is according to her ability. And so people are out there giving. We need to, according to our ability, demonstrate that respectability. So people, it will also start weeding out the rogues because people will say, hey, why aren't you getting accredited?
You know, when there are rogues, when we hear of rogues, it creates in us personally, doesn't it, a crisis of trust. A crisis of trust in those organisations, and we wonder, will we give generously or will we withhold? And now this can be a crisis that could be for us personally, and it could be a crisis organisationally. We haven't got much time left for the conversation, Gary, but if I'm a person who has a crisis of trust right now, what's the answer? Is there something that needs to happen in my heart to loosen the purse strings for my generosity? And then there's the flip side. What has to happen if there's a crisis of trust with your organisation, what you do to actually turn things around? Is there something you can do right now?
This is a great last topic, and I can join the call or the show again another time. But what I'll say on this topic of trust is it's something that's not easily gained and it's quickly lost. And so trust is something that needs to be guarded. And so if you're wounded because you've been burnt, don't allow that sin that someone else committed that left you burnt, that left you angry, frustrated. Don't let that sin define you and define your generosity. Use, as it says in Luke 16:9, use your worldly wealth to make friends for eternity, and they're going to welcome you into your eternal dwellings. In other words, use the money God's given you for kingdom purposes. Don't stop doing that. But simultaneously, if you've been on the side where you've lost trust, where your organization has not been accountable, it's not demonstrated trustworthiness, the key is choose the right path right now. Choose the path and that starts with honesty to say, you know what, we haven't been stewarding these resources well, and we want to build your trust, and so we're going to follow these standards. We're going to exhibit this accountability and transparency. We're even going to, get accredited. You're going to see it in our annual report. You're going to see it in our communications. And as a result, over time, you will rebuild trust, maybe with a new constituency, because some people, maybe they won't come back to you. But I want to encourage you, those who've been burnt, don't let it define your future giving. And those who have made mistakes, don't let those mistakes define you either. Chart a new future following standards of faithfulness.
Well, a new future starts today. And Gary Hoag is President and CEO of Global Trust Partners. I mentioned earlier we're talking to him from Denver, Colorado in the US, but he's only just recently arrived back on his home shores in the US after a 5 capital city tour here in Australia. And he was a guest in Australia of CMA, Christian Ministry Advancement. And I want to give a couple of websites around CMA because, as Gary's mentioned, CMA Standards Council, that's the one that's going to give that level of accountability, integrity, because if those organisations have jumped through those hoops and they've qualified to be given the stamp of approval, you might want to check out the organisations that are listed there. Now, the CMA Standards Council website is cmasc.com.au. cmasc.com.au. No doubt there's a link there on the usual CMA website, cma.net.au. And to connect with Gary Hoag, you might want to visit the generositymonk.com, generositymonk.com, and also connect with Gary at gtp.org. That's Global Trust Partners, gtp.org. Gary, just outstanding insights, and I'll just remind listeners that this conversation early this afternoon will be up on an audio podcast, and it's the sort of one that you might want to just copy and paste and send it on to the people who are in charge and running the organisations that you support. So you'll be able to get that on the Vision website. Gary Hoag, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your heart with us today on 2020.
It's my privilege to be with you again.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.